Good afternoon, everyone. Where I know we're a couple of minutes after 2, we're just letting people filter in. I want to welcome you to the Library Company of Philadelphia's 2025 Women's History Month Fireside Chat. And we're so excited to be sharing some time with you this afternoon. My name is Amy Sopchak-Joseph, and I am the director of the DeVita Tenenbaum Deutsch program in Women's History here at the Library Company. I am also Associate Professor of History at Wilkes University in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. So today I'm going to give us a brief introduction, first just to the Library Company. I'm going to give us a little orientation to the webinar, and then I will introduce our speaker. So today you are here joining us, and our sponsorship is through the Library Company of Philadelphia, which was founded in 1731 by Benjamin Franklin as a subscription library, which meant that its financial support really came through its shareholders who gained access to its collections by paying a small fee. And shareholding is something that is foundational to the Library Company still today in 2025. Right now, the Library Company is an independent research library, which concentrates on American society and culture from the 17th through the 19th centuries. It is free and open to the public, and we have an extensive collection of non-circulating rare books, manuscripts, broadsides, visual culture, ephemera, photographs, works of art, all kinds of things. And our mission is really to foster scholarship and increase public understanding of American history before 1900 by preserving and interpreting the valuable materials in our care. So today, our program is generously supported by the DeVita Tenenbaum Deutsch program in women's history, which has funded fellowships, acquisitions, and programming for more than a decade. And the history of women's involvement at the Library Company is lengthy and nuanced. Women have been using the collections since pretty much the beginning, and they have bought shares for many generations. The beloved books and papers of many women can be culled from its stacks, and today's speaker will talk about a number of the materials that she has used on fellowship, supported by the DeVita Tenenbaum Deutsch program. And I was very lucky at almost the same time, not exactly the same time as Jackie, but like in very close proximity. Also, I was very lucky to work in the collections as well. So today's speaker is Dr. Jacqueline Beatty, who is Associate Professor of History in one of our kind of like neighboring areas at York College of Pennsylvania, where she teaches courses in early American history, women's and gender history, and public history. She received her PhD from George Mason University in 2016, and she will be talking today about her first book, Independence, Women and the Patriarchal State in Revolutionary America, which was published with New York University Press in 2023. So today you're going to see Jackie talk about her work for about 40 minutes. She, give or take, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. And so throughout the talk, if you have questions that you want to share with the group, you can just drop those right into the Q&A. When Jackie wraps up, I will rejoin us on screen. I'm going to go dark, but I will rejoin us and field those questions for her. So we'll have a little bit of discussion at the end, and then we'll wrap up right around 3 o'clock. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Jackie. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully I get this right. I have multiple screens I'm looking at, and I'm not the most technologically adept. Okay, hopefully that should work. I'm going to move this little bar out of the way. Okay, thank you all for being here today, pulling yourselves away from the very compelling basketball games I was watching myself. So I'm going to start my talk today by introducing a woman who has long been central in my educational and professional life. And her name, there we go, is Elizabeth Graham Ferguson. Elizabeth Graham Ferguson lived both in Philadelphia and in Horsham, Pennsylvania. She herself came to be known as being among the most learned of 18th century American women, a poet of some note. She was well known among elite society for hosting salons in her Graham Park home, fulfilling the domestic role vacated by her mother after Anne's death in 1765. These so called attic evenings attracted some of Philadelphia's most influential elite. And it was at one of these such events on December 7th, 1771, believe it or not, that the city's most prominent doctor, Benjamin Rush, brought a young man named Henry Hugh Ferguson to Graham Park. Now, by most accounts, observers noticed an immediate attraction between the two. But Henry, who is a recent Scottish immigrant and a penniless one 12 years Elizabeth Jr., was perhaps needless to say not Thomas Graham's first choice of spouse for his daughter. Nevertheless, Elizabeth and Henry married clandestinely in April of 1772, and the two maintained this secret for months. On the day in which Elizabeth had finally worked up the courage to tell her father about the nuptials, he suffered a heart attack and died while walking the grounds of their Graham Park property. She wrote of the incident to a friend, explaining that as she watched her father walk toward the house from her window, she resolved to tell him about her union with Ferguson, but as he got closer, he had fallen to the ground and died before she was ever able to share the news with him. And I love giving talks virtually because they're so accessible, but the one thing I really hate is that I can't see the jaws on the floor when I share this story. So I do share this story not because of its, particularly devastating and rather dramatic nature, but because of the really complex legal, political, and marital morass it set in motion. In the 18th century, Anglo American society followed the English common law practices. Pertaining to women, Sir William Blackstone wrote in his Commentaries on the Laws of England that, at the time of her marriage, a woman became femme couverte, a covered woman, under the protection and influence of her husband. As a result, she was to depend almost all the legal rights, duties, and disabilities that either of them acquire by the marriage on her husband. Blackstone acknowledged that these, quote, no, I'm going the wrong way, disabilities, which the wife lies under, are for the most part intended for her protection and benefit. He even went so far as to describe women's legal situation as making them a, quote, favorite of the laws of England. This system, known as coverture, expected women's legal and financial submission to men, and in exchange, a husband was bound to provide his wife with necessaries by law as much as himself, for he has adopted her and her circumstances together. While women's dependent status was pretty well defined under the law, it also really permeated Anglo American society and culture in the Revolutionary era in the form of conduct literature. And conduct literature is actually what I spent most of my time under fellowship at LCP looking through. Pamphlets, novels, magazines, essays, and poems all established separate standards of behavior for women and men, especially in regard to their marital roles. The good wife, for example, was charged with the task of upholding the solemn contract of marriage by remaining virtuous, constant, and faithful to her husband, chaste, pure, and unblemished in every thought, word, and deed, right? No big deal. She was to be submissive to her husband's authority, and she was to desire and strive to obey him by her own inclination. Women, though, were not the only ones called to perform certain standards of comportment in this mutual relationship. Just as wives owed a certain amount of deference to their husband's authority, so too were husbands expected to behave in a certain way. Men were specifically entrusted with the duty of providing financially for their wives, protecting women under their covered status. Ultimately, women remained legally, economically, socially, and in many ways culturally dependent on men. So, Thomas Graham's death had very real consequences in Elizabeth's life. Upon her marriage to Henry, Elizabeth became femme couverte, her independent legal identity subsumed by that of her new husband. Any property or money she stood to inherit, which was rather substantial in this case, would by default instead belong to her husband. Had Thomas Graham been informed of his daughter's intention to marry the penniless young Scot, he could have arranged for legal provisions that would have kept his property from Henry, putting it in a trust of sorts for Elizabeth to control and inherit independent of her husband. Such marriage settlements were not common in early American history, but they were possible and regularly employed by the wealthiest in these societies. The trouble was, of course, that Thomas died before he ever knew about his daughter's marriage. Even worse, as Henry utilized his newfound social prominence, traveling across the Atlantic and spending time in Britain, a war broke out between the crown and its colonies in North America. During his stay in England in 1775, Elizabeth wrote to her husband advising him to remain in England amid the violence and turmoil at home, and he did so until about 1777. When he did return to the colonies, he came with Sir William Howe, the commander of the British forces, while openly declaring his loyalty to Great Britain. At the time, Philadelphia was occupied by British troops, and Elizabeth was already quite apprehensive about crossing into occupied territory from Horsham to meet them. Henry later used her as an intermediary, sent to implore George Washington, then commander of the Continental Army, to renounce independence and surrender to General Howe. Similarly, Henry and his brother Adam Ferguson attempted to convince Elizabeth to orchestrate a bribery scheme to undermine the Continental Army. Both of these episodes would cause significant political problems for Elizabeth and damage her reputation. The British occupation of Philadelphia ended in June of 1778. A few months prior to that, the Confiscation Act gave the revolutionary government the power to claim all property from those who maintained their loyalty to the crown. Likewise, offenders could be banished from the state and, in certain cases, hanged for treason. Henry was adjudged to be a traitor in October of 1778. His property, including that which Elizabeth inherited after her father's death, was then confiscated by the state of Pennsylvania. Henry had already left Philadelphia with Howe earlier that year. He first resided in New York, kind of briefly meeting with his wife in New Jersey in 1779. Immediately after this reunion, Henry sailed for Boston, from which point he returned to England. Despite several attempts on Henry's part to convince his wife to join him in Britain, and on a few occasions requests to send him money, Elizabeth never obliged. She remained in Pennsylvania for the rest of her life, and the two never saw each other again. Her marriage effectively, if not legally, ended. Elizabeth sought to regain her family's estate, her inheritance, by petitioning Pennsylvania's Revolutionary era state government. For several years, she sought a redress for the crises she experienced, working with her connections in Philadelphia society and leaning on friends for financial support and oftentimes for a place to stay. After a years long back and forth with Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council, she submitted her plea in 1781. At issue here was the state of Pennsylvania's impending sale of Graham Park, which was her father's property in Horsham. So I'd like to take a break in Elizabeth's story here to briefly talk about the process of petitioning, which was very different from what we're used to thinking about today when you kind of envision a petition. In the 18th century, petitioning was a right of subjects of the British Crown and later of citizens of the United States, and an especially potent tool for dependents in society. The petition was both a personal and a political outlet that allowed supplicants to request, or in some cases demand, certain things from the state. The number of petitions rose significantly during times of crisis, including during the American Revolution. Colonists petitioned both the British Empire and their local and revolutionary state governments, along with the Continental Congress during and after the conflict. Many scholars have studied these sources, and most pay close attention to the ways in which they provide opportunities for marginalized people like women to enter into the public political sphere. What I have found in my research, however, was that these petitions reveal the inherent and deeply rooted influence of the discourse of dependence on Revolutionary era women's lives. Women often filled their petitions with language that reaffirmed their socially and culturally presumed positions of dependence on men. They emphasized tropes of feminine helplessness and vulnerability, including, for example, financial incompetence, ignorance of the law, and dependence on their husbands to bolster their cases. While the rhetoric and narratives that permeate these petitions appear reflexive and perhaps a formality, deeper analysis reveals that women made a purposeful choice in how they presented their own stories to the patriarchal state. Thus, petitions can be viewed as an expression of women's agency through the exploitation of their subordinate status in a way that inherently, and I think ironically, rejects this status. Now, in her petition, that is available in the collections next door at HSP, Elizabeth Graham Ferguson claimed that the state's sale of the estate would serve, quote, at once to destroy the sole support of one who, must she repeat it, will not be found to have deserved evil at their hands. Elizabeth implored the council to relieve her of her insurmountable burdens and benevolently return Graham Park to her so that she might, quote, make such disposition of it as may be necessary for her future support. In closing, she reached out to the council members' sense of obligation to citizens and particularly legal dependents like women in her situation. She implored them to consider her own innocence in the matter of her husband's behavior and forgive her association with him. As an addendum, Elizabeth included a list of 41 men who could attest both to the legitimacy of her claims and to her position as an object worthy of the council's compassion. Significantly, evidence suggests that Elizabeth played a critical role in the drafting of the petition. The petition itself, as you can see, is the product of several years of edits and amendments. It's cluttered with strikeouts, crammed with commentary in the margins, all of which supplement and at times contradict the original text. Letters from Andrew Robeson, an attorney and friend of Elizabeth's, reveal at whose direction the markups were made. Robeson wrote to Elizabeth, assuring her that, quote, Mr. Matlack has been waited on and the alterations made agreeably to your desire. Elizabeth's plea, replete with tropes of feminine dependence, was a clear product of her own pen and mind, and engaged an artful strategy designed to evoke the sympathy of the legislative body. And the strategy worked. Eventually, Graham Park was returned to Elizabeth's sole ownership. She lived the remainder of her life with a close friend, Eliza Stedman, while publishing some of her poetry in magazines. Due later to financial hardship and declining health, she eventually sold the property to her niece's husband in 1795, moved out of Graham Park, and lived close by until her death in February of 1801. So, when I give talks like this, I often get asked whether women actually believed what they wrote, whether they bought into the language of their dependence on men. I certainly wondered the same while I was doing research for the project. And though I would love to find a source, a kind of letter of one of my subjects writing to a friend that she had lied to the legislature, a kind of, you won't believe what I just wrote in my petition kind of source, I found none. Many of the women I write about were illiterate or left behind few, if any, written records by their own pen or voice. To a certain extent, though, it doesn't matter. What was critical was that these women made an explicit choice to employ this language, very attuned to what their audience, what I will refer to as the patriarchal state, would want to hear. And in most cases, as with Elizabeth's, it worked. There were those, of course, who did not employ this language. A minority of women petitioners chose instead to chastise the state or their husbands, and in other words, these patriarchal authority figures in their lives, and then they did not provide the requisite supplicating language of dependent femininity in their documents. By and large, those petitions were rejected or ignored by the state. So I spend so much time on Elizabeth's story here because I think it really illustrates the complex dimensions of women's dependence and women's power in the Revolutionary era that I'd like to break down today. Early American women, like Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, understood the power inherent in their performance of and acquiescence to expectations of feminine comportment. When deployed judiciously, this language convinced men in positions of authority to provide aid, assistance, and especially relief to women in distressed situations. Joseph Reed, who was a delegate in the Continental Congress and president of Pennsylvania, wrote to Elizabeth's friend Anna Stockton, suggesting that Elizabeth was wise to target the fellow feeling of these elite men in her petitions. He said, quote, as to the lady who is the subject of our concern, I hope she and you will do me the justice to believe I sincerely pity and sympathize with her in the misfortunes which have clouded her prospects and embittered her life. My wishes and intentions ever were to soften her calamities to the utmost of my power. Further, Reed insisted that Elizabeth should consider herself fortunate that the power and ability to relieve her of her distresses were, quote, lodged in the hands of gentlemen of tenderness and consideration who had a record of showing the most favorable attention to distresses like hers. So Elizabeth, in other words, was in this case utilizing the most powerful political weapon at her disposal, the petition, and put pen to paper in deploying the most effective language she could muster. And I should point out too that for those several years where there was back and forth between the executive council and Elizabeth and her lawyer, Joseph Reed was one of the leaders suggesting that Elizabeth should not be relieved because of the kind of political mess that her husband started. So it was a really significant step that this petition she wrote and submitted helped to change Reed's mind. Right. American women in the Revolutionary era, like Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, knew well the terms of their multifaceted dependencies. Despite enormous legal, social, and economic restrictions, however, early American women were far from powerless. How is it then that these women with very few rights under the law and restricted access to the political sphere were able to express power? During and after the revolution, women's petitions to what I refer to as the patriarchal state, which is the colonial, revolutionary, and early national institutions, organizations, and spaces governed and controlled by elite white men. As I said, during and after the revolution, these petitions increased exponentially. The consequences of the war for American independence provided both the impetus and the opportunity for women to seek intervention from male authorities in their communities and at the state level. In their increased interactions with the patriarchal state, women employed the very terms of their complex and intersectional dependencies as a strategy to exert agency over their own lives. Significantly, too, the American Revolution provided some women with the language and opportunities with which to claim old rights, that is, the rights of dependence, in new ways. Paradoxically, then, early American women were able to negotiate and argue for a relative degree of power, independence, and rights from the patriarchal state because of and while they existed firmly within this state of dependence. Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, of course, was not the only woman to petition her state government in the Revolutionary era. In my research, I identified thousands of petitions focusing specifically on women in the cities of Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. I expected to see some significant variation among the petitions of women in these three cities due to cultural, regional, social, and economic differences. Instead, what I found was far more common ground than I had anticipated. I looked at primary sources in which women would have been interacting directly with the patriarchal state, including petitions to state legislators, divorce records, marriage settlements, equity cases, probate records, manumission deeds, almshouse books, and charitable institution files. The language across these sources was quite similar and mirrored that of conduct literature and common law custom of the time. What differed between these three locations was the legal medium through which women sought redress from the government. In other words, it was the law within each jurisdiction itself that made women's experiences differ, though their rhetorical strategies were quite uniform. Take, for example, laws regarding marital separation that governed the lives of women in these three cities. Massachusetts had allowed for divorce for specific reasons from its founding. Puritans believing that marriage was a civil contract and could therefore be dissolved if broken. Pennsylvania had very limited options for divorce until 1785, when the Revolutionary era state government liberalized the practice. And South Carolina did not allow for divorce until at least the Reconstruction era, though that was, like many Reconstruction era policies, short lived. So I looked at divorce suits filed by women in Boston and Philadelphia and found sources somewhat comparable in South Carolina, known as femme sole trader deeds, which I'll talk about in a moment. Women in Boston certainly took seriously the expectation that their marriages were a contractual agreement. Their petitions to the Suffolk County Court really demonstrate as much. They offered up the various ways in which they themselves had held steadfast to their marital covenants, being obedient, submissive wives who acquiesced to their husband's authority, while their husbands, in turn, violated their social, economic, and legal obligations to their dependent spouses. Philadelphia women did not inherit the cultural expectation of marriage being a civil contract as their Boston counterparts did, yet Pennsylvania's newly expanded statutes regarding divorce gave women new opportunities for seeking marital separation from, for example, husbands who had deserted them years before. Like their contemporaries in Boston, though, Philadelphia women also emphasized that they had performed dutifully their subordinate gendered roles within their marriages. In these cases, women were able to gain a degree of independence by emphasizing their dependence on men. As I said, women in Charleston could not seek such redress within their marriages, but they did have mechanisms for claiming a degree of financial independence specifically in the form of femme sole trader status. Femme sole trader status gave women, married women, the right to conduct business and sign contracts. In other words, to maintain an independent legal identity. The law required that their husbands consent to the arrangement, which they did in formal documents that they submitted to the General Assembly. Oftentimes, in these documents, the men acquiesced that their wives were better financial providers than they themselves were, which provides a kind of degree of emasculation in these sources as well. So, in this way, Charleston women could gain financial independence from husbands, all while remaining dependent on them in other ways. The legal structure then was really integral in framing women's dependence and their ability to express power over their own lives. Laws are, to quote historian Laura Edwards, the aspiration of lawmakers, the vision of the kind of society they want to create, the social order they wish to enforce. But laws are also what people make them. Petitions as sources provide clues of women's lived experience when the historical record is otherwise silent. They show us the ways in which women conform to the law and social custom, but also the ways in which they made the law their own. Rather than seeing the law's power as absolute or rendering women's resistance exceptional, I'd argue that we need to rethink ideas of dependence, of power, and of the law to recognize the fullness of women's experiences through their exploitation of this confining system. So I want to provide another example here. A Bostonian woman by the name of Freelove Scott was able to successfully manipulate the law to work to her advantage, all while exploiting tropes of feminine dependence in her several petitions to the Massachusetts Assembly. Her husband, Joseph, had left Boston when the British occupation ended in March of 1776. But under the Confiscation Act, his property was then under control of Massachusetts state government. She and her children, however, remained in the city. Freelove's petition mirrored that of many other women, including Elizabeth Graham Ferguson's. In it, she crafted a sympathetic narrative intent on evoking paternalist sentimentality from the legislative body. She sought the compassion of your honor's pleas for the distresses of an unfortunate mother who has the care of 5 children without money to support them or the means of procuring it. She predicted that her family, without her husband present, would suffer certain poverty and destitution, asking that she and the children be able to live in their home rent-free until the assembly rectified the unfortunate confiscation of her husband's property. So in this case, Freelove was looking to have the assembly bend the law in her favor. Never once did she contest her husband's politics. Instead, she admitted to them, but argued that her children should not be made to, quote, suffer for the faults of their father. Consistently, she distanced herself from her husband's politics and often rebuked them, which is a really tenuous line for women to toe in the Revolutionary era. So, temporarily at least, the body agreed to her request, and she paid no rent to remain in her home with her children, at least until the assembly decreed any further resolves. Her next petition, however, was quite a bit more pointed. With her husband out of the country and she and her children still dependents, Freelove claimed a certain amount of protection in that dependence, which she believed was owed to her by the state itself. Effectively, with her domestic patriarch, her husband, no longer able to provide for them, she argued that the state itself ought to step in as a surrogate for that role. She repeated the sympathetic narrative, her helpless situation, paying the required lip service to her subordinate role. Yet portions of her petition were decidedly less deferential. Freelove wrote that she presumed her situation would have entitled her to such a share of commiseration as to have produced a suitable support for herself and family out of her husband's effects. Here, then, she simultaneously asserted her dependence and used that dependence to make demands of the government, which she believed had failed to fulfill its patriarchal role, just as her husband had implicitly failed to do himself. Likewise, the second plea was also replete with somewhat subtle accusations of the legislature's lack of sympathy for her plight. She accused the assembly, for example, of only granting her £150 in relief funds, which of course is quite a large sum at this time. Significantly, in response, the state offered a unique solution that ran counter to legal precedent at the time. Freelove Scott, the assembly ordered, was to be granted 1/3 of her husband's estate, the equivalent to her dower right. Dower was essentially a right reserved to widows who, upon the death of their husbands, would inherit at least 1/3 of all property, real and personal, that had belonged to their spouses during their lifetime. So, what the legislature did here was to effectively declare her husband legally dead in such a way that she was a widow by law and entitled to the rights therein. And the assembly used Freelove's case as a new precedent. The body became, quote, empowered to settle with any of the absentee wives remaining in this state and who have not quitted it to join the enemies of the United States of America. So Freelove Scott here really seized an opportunity to better position herself and her children financially, but in the process, her petitioning had the added effect of bending the law for women in similar situations. So I think we need to consider the law itself as perhaps a less rigid construct, but I'd also suggest that we challenge typical understandings of both dependence and power. And I'm going to start here by reminding everyone that dependence was really a kind of fact of life in colonial British America, defining relationships ranging from colonial subjects' connections to the king to wives' unions to their husbands. Both parties in these relationships had power, even dependence, and these relationships required a set of mutual obligations. Thus, dependence was not inherently impotent status. The meaning of dependence started to shift with the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Dependence then ceased to be a construct with more positive connotations in the American imagination and likewise became imbued with a sense of powerlessness. The newly independent United States required the allegiance of its people and adopted the concept of voluntary citizenship rather than involuntary subjectship. Accordingly, the law recognized women's personhood and, to a certain degree, their citizenship, but it also presumed their dependence, which codified them as legally vulnerable and passive. Dependence became highly gendered and feminized. Women's dependent status was likewise contingent on their socioeconomic status, their race, the legal jurisdiction in which they resided, and, very importantly, their relationship to men in positions of power. Importantly, and you'll have to pardon my lack of clip art skills here, dependence must not be observed as the ultimate foil to independence. These terms are not objectively dichotomous to one another, but I would argue exist on a fluid spectrum. And what you're looking at here is my attempt at illustrating a fluid spectrum, right? So I want to provide another example here about a woman named Jane. So on January 19th, 1779, a man named Carolina Lamble, who was a free Black man from Charleston, attested to his purchase and subsequent manumission of an enslaved woman named Jane. Most manumission deeds were submitted to the state by very wealthy white Americans who had the economic power to claim ownership over other human beings. So, right off the bat, Lamble's race already stands out from the rest of the source base. He testified that the amount Jane paid him for her freedom was a mere 20 shillings, right? Such a sum seems quite puzzling when juxtaposed with hundreds of deeds in which enslaved people were often sold for hundreds of pounds. Lamble, however, was not concerned with Jane's monetary value as human property. Instead, he offered as his motivation for manumission the love and affection he possessed for Jane as her husband. Lamble purchased his wife from an enslaver named Rachel Caw and used his power as a free man to liberate his wife from the institution of slavery. Because I've been focusing on the importance of the rhetoric in these legal documents, I'll highlight one phrase that I think especially notable within Jane Lamble's emancipation deed. With the stroke of a pen, as he made his mark on this binding legal document, Carolina Lamble declared that his wife Jane should henceforth be legally entitled to have and to hold herself. Lamble's diction here is really significant. Rather than present the South Carolina Secretary of State with the same rote language employed by the white men and women whose business it was to trade in human beings, Lamble and Jane chose their own words. As a result of their union, of their love, Jane would have ownership over herself. Jane and Carolina Lamble's future children, their grandchildren, their great grandchildren, and all generations that followed would enjoy the same, all descending from a free female line. At the same time, the patriarchal state dictated the process by which Lamble and Jane worked together to seize her freedom and that of their future children. Seeking to legitimate Jane's freedom under the law, Lamble purchased his wife and therefore, albeit briefly, owned her. In those moments, Jane was legally enslaved property belonging to her own husband. It was this intermediary point between slavery and freedom, a very brief moment on this spectrum, that the two facilitated together. It was temporary, a means to an end, a technicality of sorts, but it was a necessary step to ensure Jane's freedom in the eyes of the patriarchal state and in accordance with the law. You may have noticed, too, that I did not mention Jane or Carolina Lamble's petition for the former's freedom. Instead, I referred to a deed of manumission, a legal document required by the state of South Carolina to recognize officially the freedom of African Americans. Petitions submitted to state legislatures and courts by Black women across the period were quite few and far between. But in the same way that I'm asking you to reconsider our understandings of dependence and power, I'd like us to broaden our understanding of petitioning and the petitioning process. In order to truly analyze how Black women navigated the rather confining socio-legal systems created by the patriarchal state, we must likewise look beyond the traditional legal archive and consider the voices and actions of Black women in both slavery's archive and freedom's archive. In the lives of enslaved women, the patriarchal state was personified in the figure of an enslaving patriarch to whom the institutional state granted and extended its powers. Deeds of emancipation, which are often written by enslavers, can uncover the otherwise invisible anti slavery activism of those people, including women who were held in bondage. Legal sources like deeds of emancipation then provide evidence of Black women's petitioning efforts. These important sources reveal that gendered familial roles circumscribe the ways in which Black women navigated their legal status in the Revolutionary era. As was the case with Carolina Lamble and his wife Jane, Black men and women often worked together in their quest for freedom. Black husbands and fathers perform the role of protector and provider for their wives and children in really exceptional ways, especially when we compare them to what white husbands and fathers are doing in the petitions that we see from white women. Likewise, Black women fulfilled wifely and motherly duty in their interactions with the patriarchal state, despite the legal, economic, and social limitations imposed on them by their racial identity and their status of enslavement. Black women's capacity to grant freedom or unfreedom to their children was also literally embodied within them. Because of the doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum, a child's legal status of freedom, sorry, make sure that came up, yeah, a child's legal status of freedom or slavery would follow that of their mother at birth. Numerous scholars have analyzed the ways in which Black women's reproductive capacity bolstered the white patriarchal state by facilitating the natural increase of the enslaved population, both institutionally and literally, as numerous enslavers assaulted enslaved women and subsequently held their own biological children in slavery. Yet, by the same framework of law, Black women's bodies could also grant freedom to their children and, importantly, to subsequent generations of free Black Americans. The stakes of Black women's efforts in testing and exploiting the boundaries of patriarchal power, therefore, were higher than those of white women. The latter petitioned the state in the Revolutionary era for relief and assistance because of the upheavals of war and daily life, and on certain occasions doing so as a matter of survival. Regardless of the intent or need of these white women petitioners, these rhetorical strategies reinforced white patriarchs' expectations of dependent women's behavior and attitudes. Free and enslaved Black women, on the other hand, resisted the patriarchal state in a more explicit way, seeking to free themselves and their progeny from enslavement forever, performing the utmost measure of devoted motherhood. Yet notably, they too conformed to the terms of patriarchal law to codify that freedom out of extreme necessity. In numerous ways, the patriarchal state, in its various forms, did not live up to the protections it promised its dependents. In these cases, women often took matters into their own hands, relying on each other and compelling the state's compliance through the collective support of women's networks. I'd like to argue that women's interdependence, that is, their reliance on one another, was a critical component of their ability to survive in the Revolutionary era, despite the patriarchal state's legal, economic, and social restrictions that were meant to inhibit their power and agency. Women built, sustained, and depended upon female networks of interdependence when their mechanisms of protection within the patriarchal state failed them. Women relied on female family members and friends across North America and throughout the Atlantic world, really, but also in their neighborhoods, bypassing or explicitly challenging male authority in the process. Women's communal and familial networks enabled them to critique men and the patriarchal state in an effort to protect the women in their lives, in some ways usurping the role of the male protector and expressly undermining women's dependence. The historical record is replete with examples of the ways in which women came to each other's aid and defense, especially when patriarchal figures, both their spouses and the state itself, failed to provide adequate support or protection for these women. They shared rhetorical strategies in writing petitions. In some cases, they petitioned the state together or wrote petitions on behalf of their female friends and family members. Most notably, evidence in depositions from divorce suits indicates that women more readily provided witness testimony in support of other women than did men. In a number of cases, too, women literally and physically intervened to protect their neighbors and female family members from domestic violence and thus saving their lives in the process. And I'm happy to talk about some of those cases during the Q&A, people, if folks are interested. Right. So this interdependence really proved to be a critical fail-safe when the patriarchal state and household patriarchs proved inadequate protectors and providers. Like dependence and independence, I think we need to think about power and expressions of power as existing also on the spectrum. While traditional understandings of power imply some form of domination of one party over another through possession, control, command, or authority, this conception obscures the meaning of the word itself while also negating the exercises and expressions of power that do not conform to these standards. If power is also understood as existing on a fluid spectrum, an analysis of women's invocation of the language of dependence in their petitions to state legislatures, courts, local aid societies, and in their communities becomes much different. The notion that women could and can still express power because of their subordinate status and the protection it offers indicates that women have never been completely powerless. And in my work, I've borrowed feminist philosopher Elizabeth Janeway's understanding of the powers of the weak to investigate this phenomenon. Like other historically marginalized groups or individuals, women have been able to express a degree of power, autonomy, and agency over their own lives while still being overtly suppressed by a controlling authority. Thus, dependents expressed power in a variety of ways, including more subtle means such as claiming a public voice or becoming politically active through the submission of petitions. What's especially significant is not that women found power through petitioning various authorities, but that they found power in this way through very public declarations of their dependent, unequal, and subordinate status. While this strategy was certainly effective in remedying women's individual problems, I think that it may have also simultaneously delayed and restricted women's ability to collectively organize and push for the rights and freedoms that eluded them during and in the wake of the American Revolution. Ironically, when women engaged with, employed, and exploited the terms of their dependence as a strategy for survival, advancement, and empowerment, the unintended result of that method was to perpetuate their inequality. Without collection, with only short term resistance to individual abuses in particular situations for specific women, the system of oppression, that is, the white patriarchal state, flourishes. Patriarchy thrives when the problem identified, as was the case in Revolutionary era women's petitions, was individual men who did not conform to the system. When women identified singular abusive husbands, negligent providers, or derelict male leaders as the obstacle to their safety and survival, these men appeared as aberrant cogs in an otherwise functional machine. The real problem, however, was a hierarchical structure crafted according to deficient and erroneous presumptions that could only ever truly protect those already in power. Guaranteed protection for dependents was and is merely a veneer to hide the failures of a flawed system that can never live up to its promises. Most women in the Revolutionary era did not have the time, capacity, or inclination to pursue collective action to fight against the oppressive forces of the patriarchal state. Their tacit acceptance of their own unequal status was motivated by the need to survive in most cases, the urgency of managing the consequences of men's choices in war, in politics, and under the law, among other things. In this system, they did not or could not prioritize countering the suppression of their sex by men, instead pursuing the more feasible goal of expressing agency and power over their own individual lives. So, all of this, I think, really underscores the need to redefine and thus, in the process, reclaim women's power throughout history. We have to conduct our historical analysis based on what was possible and not project our 21st century expectations on those who lived in a patriarchal society exponentially more confining and limiting than our own. Take, for example, the case of women's rights. No, the American Revolution and the founding of a new nation, purportedly on the basis of equality for all, did not bring these ideas to fruition. Women did not claim the legal right to suffrage until at least 1920, and for many marginalized women, long after that. But that does not mean that there was not a shift in women's rights during the Revolutionary era. The most notable trend I discovered in my research was that women, in petitioning the government, began to demand aid and assistance from the state as a right, explicitly, beginning in the early to mid 1770s. This right existed on the basis of their dependence on men. The revolution did not grant them this additional right, it already existed, yet it's critical that ordinary women would start to recognize themselves as rights bearing individuals. This was a necessary step in raising their consciousness as citizens, ultimately, eventually believing that they deserved full equality under the law. Even for those women who sought to remedy only the injustices of their own statuses, their individual persistence created significant cracks in the foundation of the patriarchal system. Power is not always a matter of tearing down walls and breaking through barriers. It's not always loud, visible, or paradigm shifting. It's often slight and subtle, quiet or silent, careful not to disturb the vast machinations of subjugation against which it resists in order to make small but meaningful gains. Power, in many cases, is evidenced by that persistence amid deep and structural disadvantage built into systemic discrimination and oppression. And it is that persistence that is the through line among all instances of the fight for rights, freedom, and independence in American history. Thank you. And I'm going to try to stop sharing if I can figure out how to do that with my many screens. God, how long have we been on Zoom and I still can't get it right? So embarrassing. While I'm trying to figure this out, I think, oh, it's all the way over on my other screen. That is why. Too many screens, too many cooks. Stop sharing. There we go.
There we go.
Ugh,
I know that's the perils of the multiple monitor life.
it is.
I'm feeling the same thing. All right, so I want to remind folks who are here that you can use the Q&A option, or you can drop something into the chat as well. At this point, we're probably best off with either of those. And I always like to leave a little bit of time, or I like to grease the wheels a little bit as people take in the information and think about your argument. So I always like to have a question to start with. And
Sure.
my question for people is almost always like, what brought you to this specifically, right? Like, what was your path to deciding that, like really examining language and how women are using this language? Um, I presume you didn't know that what your argument was going to be from the
No,
beginning, right? But like, what
no.
brought you to this interest in language?
Yeah, so I think when I was preparing my dissertation proposal, I read an article by Woody Holton in, his work on Abigail Adams, where he was discussing her bond speculation work, where she kind of used the kind of as justification her position as a wife and a mother to jump into bond speculation. And I was like, well, that's, really interesting and very savvy of her. So I'd kind of intended to look at similar situations. And on my very, very first research trip for the dissertation down in South Carolina, I was speaking with the archivist and talked about my project and kind of mentioned this article. And he said, you should really look at these petitions to the General Assembly. And I was like, okay. And lucky for me, I went there first. And the the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, I think is the name in Columbia, is a beautiful institution, and they have a lot of really fantastic online indices. So I basically used the collection and then, said between 1750, 1820, Charleston, and got all the names and found them in the microfilm and just kind of went nuts. And I think after that research trip, when I was reading through the kind of images on my photos, I was seeing a lot of repetition, but I had also read a lot of conduct literature in different
Mhm.
contexts. And I just was struck by the sheer volume of the language, but also how revelatory these sources were about the personal experience of wartime and how women are kind of opening their hearts to the legislature in these ways. So I kind of fell backwards into the source base, but also then fell in love with them too.
Right, right. Well, and thank goodness for good librarians, right? And thank goodness for
Absolutely.
that opportunity to be able to talk to someone who knows the material that they have. I mean, so
Yeah.
many stories, so many of our works, would not be possible without that.
Yes.
So we have a couple of questions that have come up, and so I'm going to ask one that's first specific to Elizabeth Graham Ferguson and then a kind of like broader one. So, one attendee has asked, do you know any more about the 41 men who signed Graham Ferguson's petition? Who were they, and can we make any generalizations about men who supported women's petitions?
Yeah, somebody asked me about this recently too, and I like went back into my photos, but they're all disorganized and I can't find the original. I'm almost positive it's in the Gratz collection over at HSP if folks are interested. But I do know that they were men of her social circle, so they would have been kind of more elite men. Like if I were to guess, I think that Benjamin Rush signed it, right? He knew her quite well, but it's not it was not super common for men to do this, but there were a handful of sources. Usually, thinking of there's a file in Harrisburg of women who were petitioning for clemency. And I think part of that was requiring someone to kind of vouch for you. But similarly, in South Carolina, I want to say after 1800, enslaved people who were manumitted had to have some kind of guarantee that they would not become dependent on the public dole. So there's a
Hmm.
couple of sources where these former enslavers would say, um, so and so has learned a trade as a midwife and she will be able to support her children and blah, blah, blah. So it was not, required for most of these sources, but it was also something that happened with enough regularity that it was helpful, right? And I think
Right.
I made the point in the talk that one of the things that helped women was their connection to men in power. And for Elizabeth Graham Ferguson in particular, the kind of rift she had with Joseph Reed, who was really angry about her husband trying to manipulate her to like literally get George Washington to surrender. He didn't let that one go for a while, so it was pretty impressive once he finally relented and was like, "Yeah, you can have your property back."
And I might have missed this, but they really needed men's support. It wasn't enough to get another support of other like well-off women.
So, not necessarily. There is
Okay.
a really great petition, and Cindy Kerner has a collection of these petitions of Southern women, and I believe it's printed in that volume as well. And there's, gosh, I forget the number. It's certainly more than 41. I want to say it's over 100 signatories on this woman's petition, and most of them are women. So
Oh,
it
wow.
kind of depends. It makes me think of Nina Dayton's work about women in the courtroom, where when you're considering issues that are under women's purview, women's
Hmm.
opinion and women's support is very important as a kind of legitimizing role.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So a kind of different question, a broader question, is could you speak to any differences between petitions before and after the Declaration,
Mm.
given what you have observed about the changes that the document provoked?
Yeah, so I think I can approach this question from kind of a gendered perspective because petitions are by nature documents of submission, right? Of humility, and they have to be to state authority. So when I often get asked, like, isn't that just the nature of the medium that they have to be supplicating to whomever they're writing to? It is true, but then the language and the ways in which these stories are presented is very gendered. So I'm thinking of a case in Boston, and I'm gonna forget the couple's name, but the husband had petitioned in the wake of the war that I believe the Continental Army had seized some of his livestock and trampled on his land, and he was seeking some financial redress for that. And his petition kind of got ignored for a while. And then later, I think a few years later, his wife came back and said, "Hey, my husband asked for this, and here's the situation." And presents the narrative from her perspective, and they grant it to her. So I
Yeah,
think in terms of the way that the language changes over time, the most significant thing I see is the way in which women start to claim themselves as rights bearing individuals or talk about. I think the very first instance I found was in, I want to say 1772 in a Boston divorce, where a woman argues that a right accrued to her to divorce, which was pretty cool, basically because her husband had abandoned the marriage or whatever the case was. So it's more kind of this social idea of dependence and independence is changing. And as it becomes more feminized, I think women are able to kind of marshal the power of that language in a much more effective way. Um,
right.
in most cases, I mean, I like to think of the cities, Boston, Charleston, and Philadelphia, as kind of like Goldilocks. You get Boston on one side, South Carolina on the other, and Philly's kind of in the middle, the sweet spot, or at least the moderating force. Um, for both Philadelphia and Charleston, the numbers of petitions skyrocket during and after the revolution because of the disruptions. Whereas in Boston, they're fairly consistent in number. And I don't know why that is. I think, that may be preservation of sources also, who knows? But
Right.
the kind of circumstances of the war obviously make women more attuned to the fact that they need to be interacting with the state, but also that notion that women are the dependent ones means they can use this petitioning medium much more effectively, I think.
Right. Well, and Pennsylvania's new state constitution is, right, like one of the most liberal, essentially, of the new states. So how
Right.
much is that also,
Yes.
it's another thing that's in the air,
Right. Yeah. And the
essentially.
divorces there obviously skyrocket too,
Yep.
relatively because they can now. Yeah.
Yep. Well, we have one last question. We're almost to three, and so I'm going to offer the one last question. So, thanks for your talk. Your discussion of motherly discourse in women's petition is fascinating. Have you looked at petitions submitted by men? And if so, how do they perform their gender?
Yeah, so that example I just spoke about, I think, is a kind of clear example of the ways in which men are not as effective. I think because, especially as the revolution wears on, they are not as sympathetic as dependent citizens, right? They have to be more independent. But I also think about, especially in Pennsylvania, where in divorce cases witness testimony was required. So there are a number of really powerful depositions that women give to talk about the kind of abuses that their friends and family members are experiencing at the hands of their husbands. And there's a couple of cases where neighbors who are, partners who are neighbors to, this couple that is getting a divorce or suing for divorce. Both the husband and the wife are interrogated in the deposition, and the wife will kind of just go off and say, he's horrible. I have had to intervene like 4 or 5 times. He had this, the fireplace poker he was using as a weapon. And then the husband is asked the kind of same questions, and he's like, I don't really know. Like, it's not, whatever. And he's very mum about the situation. And I think it really demonstrates that this kind of gendered solidarity works both ways, that women are there to support each other and provide witness testimony in court when many men are really hesitant to challenge the patriarchal authority of their male neighbors.
Well, thank you so much for sharing about your book and your research. I put and Library Company also has put the link to Independence there. You can buy it directly from NYU Press or support your local bookseller
Great.
as well.
Yeah, and
So
I'll
thanks.
say if anybody buys the book and you want a signature, I have book plates. So just send me an email and I'm happy to
So
do that.
fun.
Hmm.
Excellent. And we also included a link to the Library Company calendar. We have a number of events coming up in April and May, and look forward. The April Fireside Chat isn't up there yet, but it's going to be in just a few days. So thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon. And thanks, Dr. Beatty, for talking about your book.
Yeah, thanks
So
for having me.
you're welcome. Thanks, and see you all again soon.